The rain fell softly on Vraxis Prime, creating gentle patterns on the window of the small apartment. Inside, Commander Zekthor woke up screaming. His forearms gripped the sleeping mat beneath him, and his breathing came in rapid bursts. The nightmare had returned again, as it did almost every night for the past 20 years. Shavri, his life partner, reached over with her smaller hand and touched his shoulder. She knew better than to speak immediately. She had learned over the years that he needed time to remember where he was, to understand that the war was over, and he was safe in their home. Zekthor's large eyes adjusted to the darkness. His blue-gray skin was damp with sweat, and his heart was still racing. The dream was always the same. He was back on Epsilon Ridge, leading his battalion against what should have been an easy target. 40 human soldiers against 300 Calthene warriors. The numbers made victory certain, but the humans had other plans. He sat up slowly, his tall frame casting shadows across the room. Shavri moved closer and wrapped her arms around him from behind. She did not ask him to talk about it. They had been through this routine countless times. Sometimes he would speak, but most nights he simply sat in silence until the memories faded enough for him to face the day. Outside, the city of Vraxis Prime was beginning to wake up. This peaceful agricultural world had never seen war directly, but it housed many veterans like Zekthor. The Calthene Federation had ended its conflict with humanity 2 decades ago, and most citizens had moved on with their lives. But for those who had fought in that terrible war, peace was harder to find. Zekthor worked at the planetary archives as a military historian. His job was to catalog records from the war, to preserve the memories of battles and soldiers for future generations. It was ironic, he often thought, that he spent his days organizing the very memories that haunted his nights. But the work gave him purpose, and purpose kept him moving forward. He prepared for his day with the careful routine he had developed. First, he would clean himself. Then he would eat a simple meal. Then he would review his schedule. Structure helped. Structure kept the chaos of his memories at bay. Shavri prepared food in the small kitchen area while Zekthor dressed in his work clothes. She glanced at him occasionally, concern clear in her expression. The nightmares were getting worse, not better. Last month he had only woken up screaming twice. This month it was already 5 times, and they were only halfway through. "You should go to the center," she said, finally breaking the morning silence. "The new Human Calthene Reconciliation Center in the capital. They have programs for veterans." Zekthor's response was immediate. "No, I do not need their help. My love, these dreams are destroying you. Every night you fight that battle again. Every night you watch your soldiers die. This cannot continue." He turned to face her, his voice firm but not angry. "I am managing. I have my work. I have you. That is enough." Shavri knew better than to push further. She had tried many times before. Each time Zekthor had refused. He was a proud warrior, decorated and respected. Admitting that he needed help felt like admitting weakness, and weakness was not something Calthene warriors accepted easily. The journey to the archives was short. Zekthor walked through streets filled with other citizens going about their daily lives. Children played in parks. Merchants sold food and goods. Everything was normal and peaceful. Yet Zekthor felt disconnected from it all, as if he was watching life through a barrier that separated him from everyone else. The archives building was old and dignified, filled with rows of data storage units and physical records. Zekthor's workspace was in a quiet corner on the 3rd level. He liked it there because few people bothered him. He could work in silence, losing himself in facts and figures that demanded nothing emotional from him. Today's assignment was to catalog battlefield reports from the 3rd year of the war. He began pulling files, scanning them into the digital system and adding notes about their historical significance. The work was methodical and calming. Then he found it. A file marked Epsilon Ridge Campaign Human Personnel Records. His hands froze. For a long moment he simply stared at the file without opening it. He knew what was inside. Records of the human soldiers who had fought there. The ones who had turned his certain victory into a nightmare. He opened the file slowly. The first name he saw made his breathing stop. Lieutenant Jake Murphy. Status: alive. Current location: Earth, North American sector. Zekthor read the entry 3 times to make sure he was not mistaken. Murphy was the human who had led the defense of Epsilon Ridge. The human who had refused to surrender even when surrounded. The human who had somehow coordinated 40 soldiers into a force that held off 300 for 3 terrible days. The file contained more information. Murphy had survived the war. He had been promoted to captain and had served for 10 more years before retiring. He now worked as a consultant for the Earth Defense Forces and occasionally participated in diplomatic programs. And according to the most recent update, he was scheduled to visit Vraxis Prime in 3 days as part of a cultural exchange program. He would be giving a lecture about the war from the human perspective at the new Reconciliation Center. Zekthor felt his stomach turn. The human who haunted his nightmares was coming here, to his world, to speak about the war as if it was simply history to be discussed calmly. He closed the file and stood up from his desk. He needed air. He needed to think. He walked to the window and looked out over the city. Somewhere out there in 3 days, Jake Murphy would arrive. The human who had shown him what his people were truly capable of. The human who had proven that numbers and strategy meant nothing against an enemy who refused to accept defeat. Zekthor remembered Murphy's face, even after 20 years. Covered in mud and blood, eyes burning with an intensity that seemed inhuman. He remembered Murphy shouting orders to his soldiers, coordinating ambushes, setting traps, using psychological tactics that no Calthene commander would have considered. He remembered the moment when his own forces had cut off the human supply lines, thinking it would force a surrender. Instead, the humans had adapted, using whatever they could find as weapons. When communications were destroyed, they used hand signals. When their ammunition ran low, they built explosives from mining equipment they found on the ridge. And through it all, Murphy had led them with a determination that bordered on madness. Zekthor had tried to negotiate a surrender, to spare both sides more bloodshed. Murphy had refused. Not with anger, but with a calm certainty that chilled Zekthor even now. "We don't quit," Murphy had said through the communication channel. "You can kill us all, but we won't quit." And they had not quit. For 3 days, 40 humans had held that ridge. When it finally ended, 67 of Zekthor's soldiers were dead and over 100 were wounded. The humans had lost 23 of their own, but they had held their position until reinforcements arrived. It was the moment Zekthor realized that humanity was different from any species the Calthene had ever fought. They were not stronger or faster or better equipped. They were simply unwilling to stop. Even when logic said they should surrender, even when survival meant laying down their weapons, they kept fighting. That realization had changed everything for Zekthor. It had shattered his understanding of warfare and honor, and it had given him nightmares that lasted 2 decades. Now Murphy was coming here. Zekthor did not know if he could face him, but he also knew he had no choice. His supervisor would expect him to attend the lecture as the leading expert on that campaign. Avoiding it would raise questions he did not want to answer. He returned to his desk and tried to focus on his work, but his mind kept returning to that file, to that name, to those memories. The day passed slowly, each minute feeling like an hour. When it was finally time to go home, Zekthor felt exhausted despite having done nothing but sit at his desk. Chevry knew something was wrong the moment he entered their apartment. She did not ask immediately, but during their evening meal she finally spoke. What happened today? Zekthor considered not telling her. But she deserved to know. The human from Epsilon Ridge, the one who led their forces. He is coming here. In 3 days. Chevry's expression changed to one of concern. Will you see him? I must. It is expected of me. What will you do? Zekthor had no answer. He did not sleep at all that night. 3 days passed like a slow-moving storm. Zekthor tried to focus on his work at the archives, but his mind kept drifting to the upcoming lecture. He considered calling in sick, making an excuse, finding any way to avoid facing Jake Murphy. But his sense of duty was too strong. He had never run from anything in his life, and he would not start now. The morning of the lecture arrived cold and gray. Zekthor dressed carefully in his formal work attire. Chevry watched him with worried eyes, but said nothing. She had learned that sometimes silence was the best support she could offer. The Reconciliation Center was a new building in the Capital District, designed with both Calthene and human aesthetics in mind. Its walls were smooth and curved in the Calthene style, but its windows were large and angular like human architecture. The building itself was a symbol of cooperation, though Zekthor found little comfort in symbols. He arrived early, hoping to find a seat in the back where he might go unnoticed. The lecture hall was already filling with people, veterans from both species mixed with civilians, academics, and government officials. The atmosphere was tense but polite. Everyone here wanted reconciliation to work, but wanting something and achieving it were very different things. Zekthor found a seat in the rear corner and tried to make himself small, which was difficult given his large frame. He watched as more people entered, including some Calthene veterans he recognized from various campaigns. A few humans in formal dress sat near the front, probably part of Murphy's delegation. Then Murphy entered the room, and Zekthor felt his breathing become difficult. The human had aged. His hair was gray at the temples now, and he walked with a slight limp. His left arm was mechanical, a prosthetic that moved naturally but lacked the warmth of living flesh. But his eyes were the same, sharp and aware, constantly scanning the room as if still assessing threats and opportunities. Murphy took the stage with the help of a younger human woman who appeared to be his assistant. He adjusted the microphone and looked out at the audience. For a moment his gaze swept across the room, and Zekthor was certain those eyes paused on him. But the moment passed and Murphy began to speak. His voice was calm and measured. He thanked everyone for coming and acknowledged that discussing the war was difficult for all involved. He spoke about his background, his service record, and his current work in promoting human Calthene understanding. Then he began to discuss the war itself. Murphy talked about human military strategy, but not in the way Zekthor expected. He did not boast about victories or criticize the Calthene. Instead, he spoke about fear and survival. He described how human soldiers were trained to adapt, to improvise, to never give up even when circumstances seemed hopeless. Humans have a concept we call spite, Murphy said. It means doing something difficult or painful just to prove that we can. Throughout our history, humans have fought harder when the odds were impossible. We dig deeper when we should quit. This is not because we are naturally violent. It is because we are naturally stubborn. The audience laughed at that, a mixture of Calthene and human chuckles that eased some of the tension in the room. Murphy continued, discussing various battles and campaigns. He was honest about the Calthene casualties and expressed regret about the violence. But he also explained the human perspective, the reasons behind their tactics, the cultural and biological factors that shaped their approach to warfare. Then he mentioned Epsilon Ridge specifically. Zekthor's entire body tensed. He gripped the armrests of his chair, his forehands clenching hard enough to make the metal creak softly. Epsilon Ridge is one of the battles I think about most, Murphy said, his voice becoming quieter. We were outnumbered more than 7-1. Any reasonable military assessment would have told us to surrender. But we did not surrender. We fought for 3 days and we held that position. I lost 23 Marines. Good people, friends, and we killed 67 Calthene soldiers who were also just doing their duty. Murphy paused and his expression showed genuine pain. I am not proud of those deaths. I am proud that my Marines survived, but I carry the weight of those Calthene soldiers every day. They deserved better than what we gave them. The truth is, Epsilon Ridge represents what happens when two different species with different values clash without understanding each other. The lecture continued for another 30 minutes, covering other topics and answering questions from the audience, but Zekthor heard very little of it. His mind was locked on those words. Murphy carried the weight of those deaths. The human felt guilt. The human remembered. When the lecture ended, people began to leave. Zekthor intended to slip out quietly, but his legs would not move. He sat in his chair, paralyzed by conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to confront Murphy, to demand answers, to release 20 years of anger and pain. Another part wanted to simply leave and never think about this again. The decision was taken from him when Murphy looked directly at him across the emptying room. The human spoke briefly to his assistant, then began walking toward Zekthor's corner. Each step seemed to take forever. When Murphy finally stood before him, Zekthor realized he was still sitting while the human stood. He rose to his full height, towering over Murphy by nearly 2 feet. Murphy did not seem intimidated. Instead, he performed a gesture of respect in the Calthene tradition, placing his right hand over his heart and bowing his head slightly. The movement was awkward with his prosthetic arm, but the intention was clear. I remember you, Murphy said quietly. You were the battalion commander. You tried to negotiate a surrender on the second day. You wanted to avoid more bloodshed. Zekthor's translator device struggled to convey the emotion in his response. You refused. You killed 67 of my soldiers. For 3 days you turned that ridge into hell. Murphy nodded slowly. I know, I remember every single one of them. That is why I am here. They stood in silence for a long moment. The last few people were leaving the hall, and soon they would be alone. Zekthor did not know what to say. 20 years of nightmares had prepared him for many things, but not for this quiet conversation with the human who had caused them. Why did you not surrender? Zekthor finally asked. You could not win. Logic demanded that you give up and save lives. Murphy's expression was difficult to read. Logic and human nature do not always agree. We were trained to hold that position at any cost. More than that, we believed that if we surrendered, we would be showing weakness to an enemy that might exploit it. We were wrong about many things during that war, but in that moment, we did what we were trained and conditioned to do. You cost me 67 soldiers, Zekthor said, his voice harder now. Good soldiers. Soldiers with families. Soldiers who trusted me to lead them to victory. I know, Murphy replied, and his voice carried genuine pain. I dream about them too. Not as often as I dream about my own dead, but they are there. The Kalthine soldier I shot on the ridge's eastern slope. The 3 who died in the mine explosion we set on the second night. All of them. They haunt me. This admission stunned Zekthor into silence. He had spent 20 years believing that humans were simply violent by nature, that they killed without remorse or reflection. The idea that Murphy carried guilt, that he had nightmares, that he remembered individual Kalthine soldiers was almost impossible to process. Murphy continued speaking. I came to Vrax's Prime specifically because I knew you were here. I read your work at the archives. I wanted to meet you, to tell you that I am sorry for what happened, even though I know that sorry is not enough. Why? Zekthor asked. Why does it matter to you what I think? Because you are the only other person in the galaxy who truly understands what happened on that ridge. Everyone else has stories or reports or histories, but you and I, we were there. We lived it. And I think we both carry wounds that have not healed. Zekthor wanted to be angry. He wanted to maintain his hatred for this human who had caused him so much pain. But looking at Murphy's scarred face, at his prosthetic arm, at the weariness in his eyes, Zekthor saw something he had not expected. He saw another veteran struggling with memories too heavy to carry alone. I do not know if I can forgive you, Zekthor said honestly. I am not asking for forgiveness, Murphy replied. I am asking if you would be willing to talk tomorrow, just the 2 of us. Maybe with a mediator if that would make you more comfortable. I think we both need to speak about what happened, not as enemies but as 2 people who survived something terrible. Zekthor's first instinct was to refuse, but something in Murphy's words resonated with a part of him that had been silent for 20 years. The part that wanted to understand, the part that needed to make sense of the nightmares. Tomorrow, Zekthor heard himself say. In the park near the Eastern District noon, Murphy nodded. I will be there. And thank you. The human turned and walked away, leaving Zekthor standing alone in the empty lecture hall. He did not know what he had just agreed to. He did not know if talking to Murphy would help or hurt. But for the first time in 20 years, he felt something other than anger when thinking about Epsilon Ridge. He felt curiosity. When Zekthor returned home that evening, Chevry immediately knew something had changed. He told her about the encounter, about the agreement to meet Murphy again. She listened carefully and then asked. The park in the Eastern District was peaceful in a way that made Zekthor uncomfortable. Trees from both Kalthine and Earth grew side by side, their branches mixing overhead to create patterns of light and shadow. Children played on equipment designed for multiple species, while adults sat on benches discussing ordinary things like weather and work. Zekthor arrived exactly at noon. His punctuality was both a military habit and a way of maintaining control over a situation that felt increasingly beyond his control. He found a bench overlooking the city below and sat down to wait. Murphy arrived 5 minutes later, but he was not alone. A human woman walked beside him, carrying a small bag over her shoulder. She was younger than Murphy, probably in her 40s, with short brown hair and kind eyes. She wore civilian clothes but moved with the awareness of someone who had military training. This is Captain Lisa Grant, Murphy said as they approached. She is a military psychologist who specializes in cross-species trauma. I asked her to join us because I thought having a neutral third party might help. But if you prefer, it can just be the two of us. Zekthor considered this. Part of him wanted to refuse to keep this conversation between just him and Murphy, but another part recognized that having someone trained in these matters might prevent the conversation from becoming too emotional or hostile. She can stay, Zekthor said finally. They sat down together, an awkward triangle of former enemies and a mediator. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Lisa Grant seemed content to let the silence stretch, while Murphy looked out over the city as if gathering his thoughts. I do not know where to start, Zekthor admitted. Start with what you need to understand most, Grant suggested gently. What question keeps you awake at night? Zekthor knew the answer immediately. Why did you not surrender? I have spent 20 years trying to understand it. In Kaltine culture, surrender is honorable when the odds are impossible. Continuing to fight in such circumstances is wasteful and irrational. But you humans kept fighting even when death was certain. Why? Murphy leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. Because we are wired differently than you are. Not better, not worse, just different. Let me tell you about human evolution. Earth is what galactic surveys classify as a death world. Everything there wants to kill you. The weather, the animals, the plants, even other humans. Our ancestors survived by being stubborn, by refusing to give up even when giving up would have been easier. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Humans have a stress response called adrenaline. When we are in danger, our bodies flood with this chemical. It makes us stronger, faster, and less sensitive to pain. But here's the important part. We can override our survival instincts. We can choose to fight even when our brains are screaming at us to run. We evolved to do this because sometimes on Earth, running meant death and fighting gave you a tiny chance to live. Lisa Grant pulled out a data pad from her bag. I have studies here if you want to see them. After the war, human and Kaltine scientists worked together to understand why our species approach combat so differently. The findings were fascinating. She handed the pad to Zekthor, who looked at graphs and data he only partially understood. But certain phrases stood out. Persistence hunting, endurance running, persistence predation, all describing how humans survived by simply not giving up, by chasing prey until it collapsed from exhaustion, by walking longer distances than any other species on Earth. So you are biologically driven to resist, Zekthor said slowly. It is not a choice but a compulsion. Not exactly, Murphy corrected. We can choose. But choosing to surrender goes against millions of years of evolution. At Epsilon Ridge, my Marines and I believed that if we held that position, reinforcements would come. We believed that every hour we held was an hour that helped the larger war effort, and we believed that surrendering to an enemy we did not understand might mean torture or death anyway. We do not torture prisoners, Zekthor said, feeling defensive. We know that now, Murphy replied, but we did not know it then. Fear makes people do things they normally would not do, and we were very afraid. This admission surprised Zekthor. You were afraid? You fought like you had no fear at all. Murphy laughed, but there was no humor in it. I was terrified every single moment. So were my Marines. But human military training teaches us to function despite fear. We learn to push it down, to focus on the mission, to trust our training. That does not mean the fear goes away. It just means we do not let it stop us. Lisa Grant spoke up. This is important for you to understand, Zekthor. Humans are not naturally violent, but we are naturally persistent. When you combine that persistence with fear, training, and a belief that surrender means death, you get what happened at Epsilon Ridge. Zekthor processed this information slowly. But you suffered too. You lost soldiers. You were wounded. Murphy lost his arm. 3 years after Epsilon Ridge, Murphy said, touching his prosthetic. Different battle, different situation. But yes, we suffered. That is what I want you to understand. We are not monsters who enjoy violence. We are people who did what we thought was necessary to survive, and we carry the weight of those choices every day. Grant pulled up another file on her pad. After the war, human veterans were studied extensively. Many suffer from what we call post-traumatic stress disorder. Nightmares, anxiety, difficulty sleeping, emotional numbness. Murphy has undergone years of therapy for his experiences during the war. This revelation shook something loose in Zekthor's understanding. You have nightmares? About the war? Murphy nodded. Every few nights. Sometimes more often. I dream about the Marines I lost, I dream about Calthene soldiers I killed. I dream about moments when I made decisions that cost lives. The nightmares are not as bad as they used to be, but they never completely go away. Zekthor felt as if the ground beneath him was shifting. He had spent 20 years believing that humans were simply more brutal, more willing to kill, less affected by violence. Learning that Murphy also suffered, that he carried guilt and pain and nightmares changed everything. I thought I was weak. Zekthor said quietly. I thought there was something wrong with me because I could not stop dreaming about that battle. Other Calthene veterans seemed to move on to find peace. But I could not. Lisa Grant leaned forward. You are not weak. You are experiencing a normal response to trauma. The fact that other veterans seem fine does not mean they actually are. Many hide their struggles, and some people are naturally more resilient to trauma than others. Neither makes you weak. Murphy added, I hid my struggles for 5 years after the war. I pretended everything was fine. I drank too much. I pushed away people who cared about me. It was only when I hit rock bottom that I finally got help. There is no shame in being affected by war. The shame would be in causing that war and feeling nothing. They talked for hours. Murphy described his experiences in combat, the impossible choices he faced, the moments that still haunted him. He talked about losing Marines to Calthene fire, about making tactical decisions that saved some lives but cost others, about the guilt he felt over celebrating victories that meant other families were grieving. Zekthor shared his own experiences. He talked about the pressure of command, about being responsible for 300 soldiers and feeling like he had failed them. He described the nightmares in detail, how they changed but never truly left. He admitted that he had avoided other veterans because seeing them reminded him of what he had lost. Lisa Grant guided the conversation when it became too intense, asking questions that helped both of them see the other's perspective. She pointed out similarities in their experiences, moments where human and Calthene psychology aligned more than diverged. At one point, Murphy said something that struck Zekthor deeply. The worst part is not the fear or the pain. It is the guilt. I survived when 23 of my Marines died. Why them and not me? I was the commander. I should have protected them better. That question has haunted me for 20 years. Zekthor felt tears forming in his eyes. I feel the same. 67 soldiers died because I could not defeat 40 humans. I failed them. You did not fail them, Murphy said firmly. You did everything a commander could do. The situation was impossible. We had advantages you did not expect. Different biology, different training, different cultural approach to warfare. You could not have known. But I should have adapted faster. I should have found a way. Murphy shook his head. I have thought the same thing about every Marine I lost. What if I had positioned them differently? What if I had made different choices? But the truth is we did the best we could with what we knew. War is chaos. People die in war. That is not our fault. It is the fault of the leaders who sent us to fight a war that should never have happened. This perspective was new to Zekthor. He had always blamed himself, never questioning whether the war itself was justified. But Murphy was right. The Calthene Federation and the human governments had sent them to fight over territory and resources and pride. The soldiers on both sides were just following orders, trying to survive, doing what they thought was right. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in colors that existed on both Calthene Prime and Earth, the three of them sat in comfortable silence. Something fundamental had shifted. They were no longer just... The second meeting happened 3 days later at the Reconciliation Center. This time, Murphy had invited several other human veterans who lived on Vraxis Prime. Zekthor had reached out to 2 Calthene veterans he knew from his archive work. The group was small, just 8 people in total, but the atmosphere was charged with nervous energy. Lisa Grant had helped arrange a private room with comfortable seating and refreshments from both cultures. She explained that this would be an informal gathering, a chance for veterans from both sides to share their stories without judgment. There were no rules except respect and honesty. The humans introduced themselves first. Sergeant Danny Cole had been an infantry soldier who fought in the border campaigns. He was a large man with scars on his face and hands that told stories of their own. Corporal Amy Peterson had served as a combat medic during the final year of the war. She was quieter than Danny, with eyes that seemed to take in everything. The Calthene veterans were Sub-Commander Velron, who had led ground forces during the siege of Kepler Station, and Tech Specialist Tormesh, who had worked in intelligence analysis. Both were older than Zekthor and had seen different aspects of the war. They sat in a circle, and for a long moment nobody spoke. The weight of history sat heavy between them. These were people who had been trained to kill each other, now sitting together in peace trying to understand how they had arrived at this point. Danny Cole broke the silence first. "I guess I will start. My unit was trapped behind Calthene lines for 2 weeks during the Outer Rim campaign. We survived by raiding supply convoys and using guerrilla tactics. Every night I was certain we would be caught and killed. Every morning I was surprised to still be alive." He paused, his voice becoming quieter. "I killed at least 12 Calthene soldiers during those 2 weeks. I remember each one. The soldier who was checking supplies when we ambushed the convoy. The 3 who were guarding a communication post. All of them were just doing their jobs, probably thinking about going home, and I ended their lives." Velrun spoke up, his voice measured. "I killed humans too. Many of them. During the Kepler Station siege, my forces engaged human marines in close-quarters combat. It was brutal and personal. I remember a young human, probably barely old enough to serve, who I struck down during a corridor fight. He called out a name as he died. Probably his mother or a loved one. I hear that name sometimes when I try to sleep." The admissions opened a door. Amy Peterson talked about trying to save wounded soldiers from both sides, about the impossible choices she faced when resources were limited, about holding the hand of a dying Calthene soldier who whispered words in a language she did not understand. Tormesh shared his experience in intelligence work, how he had analyzed human communications and troop movements, how his reports had led to ambushes that killed human soldiers. He described the distance he had tried to maintain, treating it all as abstract data, until he saw the actual casualty reports and realized each number represented a living being. As they talked, patterns emerged. Fear was universal. Guilt was universal. The nightmares, the second-guessing, the weight of command, and the burden of following orders, all of it crossed species lines. The humans and Calthene had been enemies, but they had experienced the war in remarkably similar ways. Murphy shared a story about a Calthene soldier who had caught him during a reconnaissance mission early in the war. The soldier could have killed him, but instead had taken him prisoner. Murphy spent 3 days in a Calthene detention facility before being exchanged. During that time, the guards had treated him fairly, even kindly. One guard had shown him pictures of his family, trying to communicate despite the language barrier. "That experience changed how I saw the war," Murphy said. "Before that, Calthene were just the enemy. After that, I understood you were people with families and hopes and fears. It made fighting harder because I could no longer pretend I was shooting at targets instead of living beings." Zekthor found himself speaking about Epsilon Ridge from a different perspective. He described the confusion he felt when human tactics did not match Calthene expectations. He talked about his growing respect for Murphy's leadership, even as he hated what it cost his own forces. He admitted that part of his nightmares came not just from the trauma, but from the shame of being defeated by such a smaller force. In Calthene military culture, victory is expected when you have superior numbers, Zekthor explained. "Losing to 40 soldiers when I commanded 300 felt like a fundamental failure. I questioned my ability as a commander. I questioned whether I deserved my rank. These doubts ate at me for years." Danny Cole leaned forward. "Can I tell you something? In human military culture, we celebrate underdogs. We tell stories about small forces defeating larger ones. Thermopylae, the Alamo. 100 other battles where being outnumbered was seen as heroic. But those stories always gloss over the cost. They forget that the people on the other side were not villains. They were soldiers like you, following orders, trying to survive." Amy Peterson added, "I think both our cultures make the same mistake. We glorify war when we should be mourning it. Every battle, no matter who wins, is a tragedy. Lives lost, families destroyed, people traumatized. There are no real winners in war." Lisa Grant had been mostly silent, letting the veterans speak, but now she offered an observation. "What strikes me about all your stories is how similar your experiences are. Different species, different biology, different cultures. But the core emotional responses are nearly identical. Trauma does not care about species. Pain is pain." The conversation continued for hours. They shared not just war stories, but also stories about struggling to return to civilian life. Danny talked about how hard it was to hold a normal job when his combat training made him constantly scan for threats. Amy described feeling disconnected from people who had not experienced war, as if she was speaking a language only other veterans understood. Velrun shared that he had lost his first life partner because he could not stop being a soldier even at home. Tormesh admitted he had barely left his dwelling for the first 5 years after the war ended, unable to face a world that had moved on while he remained stuck in memories. These admissions of vulnerability created a bond. They were no longer humans in Calthine. They were veterans, all struggling with the same invisible wounds, all trying to find their way back to something resembling peace. Toward the end of the session, Murphy made a suggestion. What if we worked together on something? A project that could help other veterans from both species? Something that uses our experiences to prevent future conflicts or at least help people understand what war really costs. Zekthor felt a spark of interest. What kind of project? A historical account, Murphy said, looking at Zekthor. You work at the archives. You have access to records from both sides. What if we created a comprehensive history of the war that includes both perspectives? Not propaganda from either side, but honest accounts from people who were there. Show the fear, the pain, the mistakes. Make it real in a way official histories never are. Lisa Grant nodded enthusiastically. That could be incredibly valuable. Not just for historians, but for military training, diplomatic programs, peace education. Showing both sides of the conflict, humanizing both species, could help prevent future wars. The idea took root quickly. Amy volunteered to help with medical perspectives. Danny offered to contribute combat experiences from various campaigns. The Calthine veterans agreed to share their own stories and help access Calthine military records. Over the next few weeks, the group met regularly. What started as therapy sessions evolved into a collaborative project. They gathered in Zekthor's archive office, spreading out documents and data files, comparing accounts of the same battles from different perspectives. The work was emotionally difficult. Reading detailed reports of battles they had fought meant reliving trauma in vivid detail, but it was also healing. By examining these events together, by seeing how the other side had experienced the same moments, they gained understanding that had been impossible during the war itself. Zekthor discovered that in many battles, Calthine commanders had felt just as uncertain and afraid as he had at Epsilon Ridge. Murphy learned that human tactics, while effective, had caused profound psychological harm to Calthine soldiers who saw them as barbaric and unpredictable. They interviewed other veterans, both human and Calthine. They gathered personal accounts that would never appear in official records. They collected letters, diary entries, photographs, and recordings. The project grew beyond what any of them had initially imagined. During one late-night work session, Zekthor and Murphy found themselves alone in the archives. The others had left hours ago, but they were too absorbed in organizing material to notice the time. This feels important, Zekthor said, gesturing at the mountains of documentation surrounding them. More important than I expected, Murphy nodded. We are not just recording history, we are making peace with it. Every story we document, every perspective we include, is a step away from the nightmares and toward understanding. Do your nightmares come less often now? Zekthor asked. Yes, not gone, but less frequent, less intense. Talking about Epsilon Ridge with you. Understanding why you made the decisions you did. 6 months had passed since Murphy's arrival on Vraxis Prime. The collaborative historical project had grown far beyond anyone's initial expectations. What started as a small group of veterans sharing stories had evolved into a comprehensive documentation effort involving dozens of contributors from both species. The final document was titled Echoes of War, a Dual Perspective. It contained over 500 pages of battle accounts, personal testimonies, strategic analyses, and reflections on the cultural misunderstandings that had fueled the conflict. Every major engagement was covered from both human and Calthine viewpoints, showing how the same events looked completely different depending on which side you had fought for. The Reconciliation Center had organized a major conference to present the work. Representatives from both the Calthine Federation and human governments would attend, along with military officials, historians, veterans groups, and media from across multiple worlds. The pressure was immense, but Zekthor felt ready. The morning of the presentation arrived with clear skies. Zekthor dressed in his formal military uniform, something he had not worn in 20 years. The decorations on his chest felt heavier than he remembered, each medal representing a battle that now felt like ancient history. Shavri helped him adjust the collar, her hands gentle but steady. "Are you nervous?" "Terrified," Zekthor admitted, but also excited. This work means something. It could actually make a difference. Murphy arrived at their apartment an hour before the conference. He wore his own formal uniform, the human metals bright against the dark fabric. His prosthetic arm had been polished to a shine. He looked every bit the decorated officer he was, but his eyes held warmth rather than the cold distance of a soldier. They traveled to the conference center together, reviewing their notes one final time. Lisa Grant met them at the entrance along with the other veterans who had contributed to the project. Danny Cole wore civilian clothes but carried himself with military bearing. Amy Peterson looked professional in a simple dress that bore a small symbol of the medical corps. The conference hall was massive, designed to hold thousands of people. It was filling quickly with attendees from multiple species. Zekthor spotted several high-ranking Calthene officials in the front rows, along with a delegation of human diplomats and military officers. The media section was packed with cameras and recording equipment. As they walked to the stage, Zekthor felt his breathing become rapid. This was real. They were about to present their work to people who could shape policy, who could decide whether reconciliation continued or stalled, who could use this information to prevent future conflicts or simply file it away and forget it. Murphy noticed his anxiety and touched his shoulder with his natural hand. "We have done good work. No matter what happens today, we have created something valuable. Remember that." They took their positions on stage. The room quieted as the moderator introduced the project and its creators. Then it was time to begin. Zekthor spoke first, his voice steady despite his nerves. He explained how the project had started, how a chance meeting with a former enemy had led to conversations that changed his understanding of the war. He described the process of gathering accounts from both sides, the challenges of reconciling different perspectives, and the importance of presenting history honestly rather than through the lens of propaganda. Murphy followed, discussing specific examples from the document. He showed how the Battle of Epsilon Ridge looked from both sides. The Calthene records described a well-planned assault that should have succeeded, while human records described a desperate defensive action with no guarantee of survival. Both were correct. Both were incomplete without the other. They alternated, presenting different sections. Amy talked about medical perspectives, how combat medics from both species had struggled with the same ethical dilemmas. Danny discussed ground combat tactics and how cultural differences had led to strategies that seemed insane to the opposing side. The Calthene veterans shared their own insights about orbital battles and strategic planning. Throughout the presentation, they used actual quotes from veterans. Voices of soldiers who had fought, bled, and survived. Stories of fear and courage, of mistakes and sacrifice, of hatred that had transformed into understanding. The audience listened in complete silence, absorbed by the raw honesty of the accounts. When they reached the section on Epsilon Ridge, Zekthor and Murphy stood together at the center of the stage. They had decided to present this battle jointly, alternating sentences to show how their experiences had intersected. Zekthor described the Calthene approach: superior numbers, established doctrine, confidence in victory. Murphy described the human response: impossible odds, improvised tactics, determination to hold at any cost. Thor spoke about the frustration of facing an enemy who would not behave logically. Murphy spoke about the fear of facing an enemy who could destroy them with sheer numbers. Zekthor described the grief of losing 67 soldiers. Murphy described the guilt of surviving when 23 Marines did not. By the time they finished, many in the audience were openly emotional. Some veterans in the crowd were crying, recognizing their own experiences in the words. Even the officials and diplomats looked moved, though they tried to maintain professional composure. The presentation continued for another hour, covering post-war trauma, the challenges of reconciliation, and recommendations for preventing future conflicts. They emphasized that the document was not just history, but a tool for education and understanding. When they concluded, the room erupted in applause. It started slowly but built to a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Zekthor felt his eyes fill with tears, something he had not experienced in public since he was young. Murphy's expression was similarly emotional, his jaw tight as he struggled to maintain composure. The question period that followed was intense. A Calthene military official challenged their portrayal of certain battles, arguing that they were too sympathetic to human tactics. A human diplomat questioned whether presenting Calthene perspectives without criticism was appropriate given that the Federation had started the war. Murphy handled the human diplomat. "Sir, with respect, assigning blame for the war is not the purpose of this document. Both governments made decisions that led to conflict. Both populations suffered as a result. If we spend our time arguing about who started it, we will never move forward to ensure it does not happen again." Zekthor addressed the Calthene official. "Commander, I understand your concern, but sympathy is not the same as approval. We can understand why humans fought the way they did without believing their tactics were morally superior. Understanding leads to prevention. Ignorance leads to repeated mistakes." More questions came, some hostile, some genuinely curious. The veteran panel answered each one thoughtfully. Never defensive, but always honest. They acknowledged controversies and admitted when they did not have all the answers. A young Calthene student from a university stood to ask a question. "Commander Zekthor, have you forgiven the humans for what they did at Epsilon Ridge?" The question hung in the air. Zekthor took his time considering his response. He looked at Murphy, then back at the student. "Forgiveness is not the right word," he said carefully. "Forgiveness implies that someone did something wrong that needs to be forgiven. But Murphy and his Marines were not wrong. They were following their training, trying to survive, doing what they believed was necessary. I was doing the same. The war itself was wrong. The circumstances that led to that battle were wrong. But the soldiers on both sides were just trying to make it home." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "What I have found is not forgiveness, but understanding. I understand now that humans are not monsters. They are a species shaped by different evolutionary pressures, different cultural values, different biological responses to stress. They fight in ways that seem extreme to us because their survival has always depended on refusing to quit. Understanding that has not erased my pain, but it has given that pain context. It has allowed me to accept what happened rather than being consumed by it." Murphy added his own perspective. "I carry guilt for the Calthene soldiers who died at Epsilon Ridge. That guilt will never completely disappear. But working on this project has helped me understand that carrying guilt is different from being responsible for evil. We were all caught in circumstances beyond our control, making the best decisions we could with limited information and overwhelming stress. If this project helps even one person avoid the nightmares we have lived with, then every difficult moment of creating it was worth it." The conference continued for several more hours with panel discussions, breakout sessions, and networking opportunities. Veterans from both species sought out Zekthor and Murphy, thanking them for giving voice to experiences many had kept silent for years. One elderly Calthene veteran approached Zekthor with tears in his eyes. "I thought I was the only one who still had nightmares. I thought there was something wrong with me because I could not move on. Knowing that others struggle too, that even decorated commanders like you still fight these battles, it makes me feel less alone." Zekthor embraced the veteran in the traditional Calthene manner. "You are not alone. None of us are. That is what we wanted to show with this work.